Good morning, everyone. This is the final recording on Vody Backham's fault lines. This has been an incredible journey. And so as we cover the final chapter and the book as a whole, I want to start by delving into some theology that's present kind of throughout, and especially here in the last chapter. There's an important word that I think sums up the debate. It's efficacy. It's the effectiveness of something, the sufficiency of something. And here's what I want to say. To those who disagree with some or all of what Dr. Vody Backham offers in Fault Lines, I want to make crystal one thing. Everything he writes is coming from a position that, based on his reading of the literature, his analysis of case studies, his entire perspective is seeing critical social justice and critical race theory as an offshoot of that, making the claim that the death of Christ on the cross is not sufficient for reconciliation in the face of any sin. So if you understand that Vody is seeing the literature, seeing the case studies, seeing the behavior and the words of advocates of CSJ and CRT as being an attack on the power of God present on the cross and the power of God for justice, it makes it easier to understand the adrenaline and the strength of voice that he employs. I think anybody who has a genuine faith in Christ would shirk back and be upset and indignant and just furious over the claim that God isn't powerful on the cross, or that God's justice is somehow incomplete on the cross. It seems to me that Vody has a theological position that claims that all of the punitive and reconciliatory justice required for any situation occurred on the cross. That seems to be a position he takes, and so that I question that to a certain extent. I really appreciate what Fault Lines offers, but I don't think he's theologically consistent in this perspective, because it seems that he desires justice to be done, but he views justice in a certain way as having already been accomplished. And so I wonder about the consistency of that, kind of reflecting on the book as a whole. I think another thing to kind of be cognizant of is that Vody is addressing critical race theory and critical social justice as they appear to be represented in Christian circles. He gives some background and some analysis to the movements as a whole, but overwhelmingly his focus is on their presence in the Christian church. And so it's difficult to draw equivalencies because you have a different assumed worldview trying to mesh with the critical social justice worldview than, say, a Buddhist or a Hinduist or a Muslims. That's the thing, is that each advocate for critical social justice is going to have meshed and incorporated their previous worldview into a new worldview. And so this is where I think that what we're really seeing is we're seeing a wave and a rise of a new category of worldviews which start from critical social justice and tie in elements of other preferred traditions. So that's kind of the two things that I wanted to hammer on, kind of reflecting on the book as a whole. And I think, again, something to understand is that this isn't an academic text. It's not. Anybody who says it isn't necessarily familiar with the workings of academic citation practices and things like that. Now, then, that being said, it's written by an academic, but it's not an academic text. I think another wonderful example of this would be some of Lee Strobel's books. They're not written as academic literature, and we don't tend to treat them as such. Fault Lines should be no different. It is slightly more academic than something like The Case for Christ, but it's not academic literature. It is popular literature written by an academic author to address cultural phenomena within the evangelical movement. And so with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and we are going to move into the final chapter of Fault Lines. This is chapter 11, Solid Ground. He begins the chapter kind of outlining his first trip to Africa, where he met with a pastor and or rather the father of the pastor, and he came to forgive a lot of the circumstances that led to his being in America. Listen to this. I forgave the Africans who took my ancestors' freedom. I forgave the Americans who bought and exploited them. I forgave the family that replaced my identity with their German name. I just forgave. I did not harbor any ill will. I did not feel entitled to any apologies or reparations. By God's grace, I recognized that Providence had blessed me beyond my ancestors' wildest dreams or my own. And so this is where we get into the justice stuff. This is on page 229 of Fault Lines, chapter 11, Solid Ground. And so here's what it is. I have heard a mantra lately that rings hollow in my ears. There can be no reconciliation without justice, is the quote. When I hear that, I want to scream, yes, and the death of Christ is that justice. All other justice is proximate and insufficient. It is because of Christ's work on the cross that we can heed the apostles' admonition. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ forgave you. So, regardless of your explicit opinions on fault lines, you cannot address fault lines in understanding what exactly, you can't understand the argument if you don't understand Vody Backham's theological positions. This is something that I've learned the hard way diving back into C.S. Lewis. I'm preparing a blog post for December on the Great Divorce, and I'm realizing I need to do some serious reading on Lewis's theology so that way I can better understand the point that he is making. Regardless of whether or not I think his theology is 100% correct, I can't understand his literature if I don't understand his theology. And I think that's something that people need to understand about Vody. And yes, he gets into his theology at certain points, but why not spend the time to get familiar with him? To be familiar with the author with whom you are reading. Something that he writes here on page 230. I harbor no animosity against anyone named in these pages, and if you happen to agree with my perspectives on these issues, I hope you don't either. So let me address something that kind of sparked my reason for doing this 13 episodes on fault lines. The number of conservative evangelical Christians I have seen citing similar arguments or the arguments of Vody Backham in a way that seems to portray hatred or animosity towards other believers. That's not okay. Hatred is not a character. No, I can't say that. I can't say that. I was about to say hatred isn't a characteristic of God, but there are passages where God, where the Old Testament explicitly records God as hating certain things. So I can't, it's not accurate to the scriptures to say that hatred is not a characteristic of God. That I guess the way that I would put it is human hatred is not a characteristic of God. And in fact, I would go a step further in saying that human hatred by the nature of our flesh is not reconcilable to divine hatred. I don't think humans are capable of divine hatred towards one another. That's a personal opinion. Don't take it as some super theological answer. That's just a personal opinion that I have, and opinions are like buttholes. Everybody has one. I learned that from Phil Carlson. And so on page 231, Vody records something from J. Gresham-Machen. If you are familiar with Reasonable Faith, this is an author that William Lane Craig quotes as well. But here's the quote. Men tell us that our preaching should not be positive and not negative, should be positive and not negative, that we can preach the truth without attacking error. But if we follow that advice, we shall have to close our Bible and desert its teachings. The New Testament is a polemic book, almost from beginning to end. Let me ask a question of everyone. Do you believe it is possible to present a positive case for Christian truth without supplying a negative case towards non-Christian truths? In essence, can you defend something without denying something else? Anyway, I think that what Vody gets into is he really hones in, really focuses in on trying to offer a perspective on race and justice. And Vody says he's not trying to offer an alternative solution to the problems of social justice because he doesn't believe they're legitimate problems. But what's interesting is that he is borderline throughout the book dogmatically assertive of this perspective where if we get our theology on grace, justice, and those things correct, then our issues with one another will resolve themselves in time through prayer and petition with Christ and the study of scriptures. And I'm inclined to agree. I've never really been convinced that systemic racism is accurate. I think that at one point it was, but the critical claim is that discrepancy is evidence of racism. I don't agree with that. I think discrepancy can be an indicator of previous policies that were racist, but I don't think discrepancy is racist in and of itself. I think in certain regards, I think that a lot of the economical issues that are put under social justice are not racial. I don't think that it's fair to say that something's origin defines its entire existence. Let me put it another way. The Kalam cosmological argument was crafted by a Muslim theist, and it is used by Christian apologists. So, you have an origin that is antithetical to Christianity, and yet it is used by Christian authors in support of Christian theism and theism in general. Why do we not assume that something's nature can change from its origin as it relates to systems and things of that nature? I think that one of the most fundamental opinions that leads to the acceptance of critical race theory is the idea that because something was caused by racist policy, the current situation is by definition a result of racism. I don't think that's the case. Or rather, I don't think the solution is trying to deal with it as a racial problem. I think it resulted from a racial issue. I think it resulted from the racialized perspective that is visible in certain stages of United States history, but I don't think the solution is a racial-based solution. I think it's an economic solution. I think it's a solution of examining culture and asking the question, what needs to change the way society exists? And ultimately, I don't think that is a racial thing. I don't think the changes are racial perspective changes. I think they are economic changes. I think we need to return to a position of trying to care for our fellow man. I think that men need to be held to a higher standard. I think And I don't mean that just in relation to, small or simple things. I think that in a lot of ways, if we're going to solve the issues that Vody Backham rises, men have to rise up. Men have to take a stand and say, I will lead my families. I'm only 21 years old, but I know within my heart of hearts that at the end of the day, that at the end of the line, what matters is my obedience to Christ as it relates to my fulfillment of the Great Commission, the unique purpose he has called, qualified, and is equipping me for, and the love and affection I am commanded to give to my fellow man. I think that in a lot of ways, socialism is a response to the issues we see, because it seems like it's a solution to the breakdown of community and the moral corruption of capitalist behavior that we see in the big businesses at times. But I don't think that's the case. I think what really needs to happen is that if we want to fix the economic corruption of the United States, we need to fix our communities first. We need to restore our communities. We need to rebuild the sense of family. We need to rebuild what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman. We need to rebuild our foundations as a society. If we want to recover in any way, shape, or form as a church, we need to look at the foundations of our lives, our families. I was at Promise Keepers earlier this year, and one of the things that really stuck with me is that the moral, mental, the positions of a man, the status of a man as a human being in his life affects his family. His family affects his community, his neighborhood rather. His neighborhood impacts the schools, the churches. Everything can be whittled down to a man's positive or negative influence. So the question that we have to lay down is, as an individual, am I negatively or positively influencing society towards a good foundation for community? Look at the relationship between Corey Miller and sorry, I'm forgetting his name. I know y'all are close. But Corey Miller, I think it's the president for Ratio Christi, kind of across the nation. And he's got a friend who is an atheist and a philosophy and a professor at a university. And the professor left because of social justice influencing the universities and the academies. I think in a lot of ways, there are a lot of issues that Vody identifies in fault lines that can be addressed in our general society, but I don't think that they are good to focus on, because we need to get things right in the church first. If we can't love each other, if we can't figure out how to deal with our own crap, what use are we to the nation we exist in? This was a really short chapter. All in all, I have loved getting to read fault lines. I have loved getting to go through this process. And I am admittedly a little bit ready to take a break from the book reviews. I'll be focusing on kind of pumping out some blog posts over the next couple of weeks while I take a break. For some reason, writing blog posts is less taxing than these are. I love what I do. But if you're a man and you're looking for someone to help you learn how to lead a godly life, don't be afraid to reach out. You can find me. My name is JT Martin. Look for Phil Carlson. Look for Stan Bauer. Look for CBMC. Look for good local churches. Find men of God to help you become the man God created you to be so that you can lead your family to become the family that God created them to be. With that being said, this has been the In Step with God podcast. This is episode 13 of the Fault Lines Review and the final episode of the Fault Lines Review. Thank you. It has been a wonderful journey. God bless.